All right, let's talk history of my startups and the technologies that I used to use to build each of those startups. So, in the past 10 years, I've built 6 startups. And my stack for each of those startups was very different than what it is now. It has drastically changed from that first startup to what I do now. So I thought it would be kind of cool to go through each of the startups that I've done and talk about very high level what they are, but more importantly, what I actually used to build those startups. So the first startup that I ever built, I was in college, I was a freshman in college, and it was called Mogulvate. And the idea was that I wanted it to be kind of like LinkedIn, but specifically for entrepreneurs. I was really struggling meeting people that were entrepreneurs or wanted to be entrepreneurs at that time. And so I thought that would be a cool idea. And so I built it using WordPress. And then WordPress has a plugin called BuddyPress that you can use, which basically turns your WordPress website into a social network of sorts. Um, this was great. It worked really well. More on that later. Yeah, more on that later. The next thing that I did was a startup called How You Doing. How You Doing was kind of like a marketplace for students at the university that I went to, and I used WordPress for that as well as whatever e-commerce plugin WordPress has. I don't remember what it was called. In both cases, though, I would just use simple shared hosting like GoDaddy, or I remember there being this one called WP Engine that was really good. There was another one called SiteGround that I used. So I use those companies. This is not sponsored by them at all. I use those companies for my hosting, and overall, like WordPress worked pretty well. But again, more on that later. Like we haven't quite reached the problems that I ran into with WordPress yet, but we're about to on this next one. This next one was called Student Cribs. And essentially the idea was at the university that I went to, there were a lot of off-campus housing opportunities. So people would not live in dorms, they would live in privately owned housing, apartments off campus or around the university, right? And I built this using WordPress, which worked really, really well at first. But I ran into a problem where I was going to partner with this company, and the company said, okay, we have some requirements. Our API, our system, needs to be able to hit your system every 4 hours so that we can update the status of all of the apartment listings. Basically, this was going to allow me, I was manually importing, or not inputting, inserting each listing into the website myself. And partnering with this company was going to allow me to automate that process. And they need to be able to hit my API, which I didn't know anything about at the time. I didn't know how to code whatsoever. So I ended up contracting someone in another country to do this work for me. He was going to build a special customized WordPress plugin for me that was going to basically allow this to happen. And midway through the contract, it was going to be 6 weeks, so about 3 weeks in, he reaches out to me and says it's not working, and he cancels the contract. And I was pretty upset. I mean, I got the money back, so that was fine. But I was pretty upset because this was going to be a really, really big deal in terms of getting my startup off the ground and getting it to actually be, more legitimate, I felt. Unfortunately, that didn't work out in that moment. And so I decided that I would learn how to code. I had always wanted to learn how to code, but because of my dyslexia, I always struggled with it, quite frankly. And so this was kind of like a defining moment for me where I kind of forced myself to get over the initial hump and actually learn. So I ended up not really knowing what anything was. I took a bunch of courses online, and I ended up building a new website for student cribs using Django, which is a Python framework that allows you to build websites. And I used Postgres as my database, and then I hosted it on DigitalOcean, as I recall. And the reason I hosted on DigitalOcean is because they had like a flat rate $5 a month hosting plan where you could get like a virtual server for $5 a month, and AWS and GCP didn't have that, and I was afraid. I didn't really understand how they worked, and I was afraid of being charged a lot of money. Next came something called Everest. So Everest was kind of similar to Mogulvate, but this was going to be just for designers and developers. There used to be something like this where designers and developers would sort of show off their work and pose questions to one another, and it was really, really a great community. There was something else like this called Forest. I don't know. But it was acquired by a few different companies and eventually was shut down. So I thought it'd be cool to maybe try and build that up again. At first, I used WordPress with that same BuddyPress plugin that I mentioned at the first one for MobileVate. But then once I learned Django, so I kind of like I had done work like Everest before Student Crib, so like the order's a little bit out, and then I came back to it. And when I came back to it, at this time I kind of had been learning about Django and Python, and so I decided to build it using Django and Python. It worked pretty well. Doesn't exist anymore, but it worked pretty well. The next one that I was working on was called DevGrub. DevGrub was basically a way for people to share their recipes, I called them, for how to build certain things. Oftentimes, when you're coding something, there are many different ways to accomplish the same goal. And so I was basically going to build this thing, which was going to be a cookbook of sorts where people could share their different recipes for how to accomplish the same task. And I thought that was going to be pretty cool. So I built the front end with React. I built the back end with Node.js. I used JavaScript, no TypeScript, and then I used MongoDB as my database. I don't really remember how I did auth, to be honest. Um, there was probably some package that I used, but I really don't remember what it was, and unfortunately, I don't have the code anymore. So that brings us to like the current ones that I'm working on. I have an app on the App Store that I don't really support anymore because it kind of shifted away, but I'll make another video on that later on maybe. But the company is called Lyfer, Lyfer, and the app that I have on the App Store, both for iOS and Android, actually I think I took them down. But anyway, I had built an app on the App Store in Flutter. So Flutter, I think I mentioned this in my last video. Flutter is a framework for building mobile apps, all kinds of front ends really, but in this case, mobile apps. You build it once, you code it once, and then you can publish it or you can build it for or compile it for iOS and Android. And so it works really, really well. I have had very, very little problems using Flutter. I'm a huge, huge advocate for using Flutter. The backend for that is Firebase. So this handles my database, it handles my authentication, it handles any server environments through serverless functions to run my API. And then more recently, currently, I'm working on a web app for Lyfer, kind of shifting my go-to-market strategy a little bit. And so I'm using Next.js and React for that instead of Flutter because I don't need the mobile app anymore. And along with that, I'm also still using Firebase, which again handles my authentication. It handles any serverless server environments that I want through serverless functions. It handles the database with Firestore. It's pretty great. And I also use Neo4j for that, which is a graph database, which is really important. I need this because I'm building a recommendation engine as a part of it, and I'm also building a social network kind of a thing. So that's what I use that for. There is one final startup that I'm working on or starting to think about right now, and it is a secret Apple Watch app idea that I have, which I'm going to make a more in-depth video of me just building a startup in like 3 days or something like that. But for this, I'm going to use Firebase still, I think, and then I'm going to use native Swift and whatever other native Apple stuff I would need to use because since it is an Apple Watch app, Flutter can't actually do that, unfortunately. So I will need to use the native stuff. I don't know how to do that, again, as I mentioned. So that'll be a really fun 3 days, or maybe it'll be 7 days longer than 3 days because I'm starting from scratch, basically. Yeah, the big takeaway, like there's two lessons that I want to kind of impart on people from this. Number one is that if you're serious about wanting to be an entrepreneur or wanting to be a founder, it's really important and useful that you learn how to code. You don't have to become a master programmer or an expert software engineer or anything like that. That's not necessary. But what you do need to do is become good enough that you can build your own MVP. And the reason that that's important is because for me, in my early days as a founder, I was relying on other people. So I was either using something like WordPress that other people had built, and WordPress had a lot of limitations where I couldn't actually build things that I wanted to do, or I had to contract someone out, and that ended up kind of being a disaster because they canceled on me, and then I was screwed. I was basically just I was a boat that couldn't move in the middle of a lake or in the middle of an ocean because I couldn't code. I was relying on them to do this, and I was pretty much stuck. So that's the reason that you would want to learn how to code, at least to be able to build an MVP. Secondly, is that when you do finally find a stack, like go look up stacks. Like the stacks now I think that are available are they're pretty solid. Like you'll be able to build maybe 90 to 99% of things that you want to build. There are some edge cases, like for example, my thing with the Apple Watch app, but usually you'll be able to build whatever it is that you want to build just by learning a really popular stack. But the most important thing there is that you don't chase new technologies. As fun as it might be to learn about new technologies, if you focus on the one that you're using, you'll become really good at it to the point that you can just build whatever idea that pops into your head. You won't actually have to learn very much that's new as far as coding goes because you know the stack so well, and you'll be able to use it to your advantage to basically do whatever you want. It'll become an advantage that you have over a lot of other people who don't know how to code. So, hope that was useful. If you like this video, subscribe, like, share. That's a good one. Share the video, turn on the bell symbol, and all that stuff. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Peace.